Hello and welcome to Writing with Steve, with me, Steve Evans. The autumn days are getting shorter and the weather outside is getting colder. Although you wouldn't believe it today where I am, it's a really lovely sunny day outside. However, this is the perfect season for writing and getting some writing done. And the reflective mood that autumn often brings means it's a great time for writing poetry. So I hope you've got your poetry hats on today, and we're continuing where we left off in our last video. We're continuing to look at poetic forms. Today we're looking at the Tanka. The Tanka is a Japanese poem similar to the haiku in that it has a limited number of syllables that the poet uses. Haiku uses 17, Tanka uses 31. The word Tanka translates roughly as short song, and in the traditional Japanese form of the poem, it is usually written as one unbroken line. However, you don't have to stick rigidly to that rule, and as the poems I show you demonstrate, lots of poets have adapted them to their own use. You'll also find similarities between Tanka poems and sonnets, so if you haven't watched our video on sonnets, please check that one out too. For example, they often use personification, metaphors and similes. They often contain a volta or a turnaround in the poem as well, usually in lines 2 or 3 rather than line 9 in a sonnet. So look out for examples of those poetic devices when we look at examples of Tanka poems. Lying on the June sand, this day I recall, remotely, the anguish of my first love. Cherry, 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 trees begin to bloom, and bloom is over. In the park where nothing, it seems, ever happened. The hot water in the abandoned kettle slowly cools, still carrying the resentment of cold water. And as you can see from that selection of classic and modern Tanka poems, you can write about any subject you wish, even boiling kettles. Traditionally, they were always about nature and giving rise to reflection and meditations. But again, you have the flexibility in your writing to include any subject matter. So if you've begun writing haiku and you're quite familiar and confident writing haiku, what you could do is to see the Tanka as a poem where you can write haiku and then complete the poem with 2 couplets. So they add to 31. Not necessarily, however, in that sequence of syllables, but it might be a good starting point to start as a haiku and then complete as 2 couplets, however, not rhyming couplets. My other advice is use enjambment to keep the poem flowing. Also, avoid ending too many lines in a row with a 1-syllable word. If you're unfamiliar with the term enjambment, it basically means run-on lines, which means that the poet isn't end stopping his thought or her thought on one line of the poem. To make full sense of what the speaker in the poem means or is saying, you need to run over to the next line. Sonnets often use enjambment as a technique, and it makes the poem flow, and it also makes the poem conversational in tone. So why not try writing a Tanka poem today? And if you like, why not share it in our comments box? The next poetry form we're looking at is a hugely popular form, and it's the ballad. The ballad is a traditional poem, and it also has its roots in music. So it's one of those poetic forms that easily lend themselves to music, and there's a kind of crossover between verse and lyrics. Traditionally, ballads tell a story, a tale. Centuries ago, when many people could not read and there were no newspapers, ballads were a great way of spreading news nationally, with a balladeer moving from town to town, city to city, relating the latest happenings in the country. And the latest happenings were often formed into songs and poems. So it has a rich and noble tradition. It has an unusual structure. So, for example, unlike the sonnet, which employs iambic pentameter, so if you're unfamiliar with iambic pentameter and the use of 10 syllables and stresses, please check out our previous video on sonnets. Unlike the sonnet, the ballad has a distinctive pattern and frame. A simple way to describe it would be it uses a stanza or verse which comprises of 4 lines. The first line usually uses 8 syllables, the second line 6 syllables, the third line 8 syllables, and the fourth last line of the stanza back to 6 syllables. The technical terms for these are iambic tetrameter in respect of the 8 syllables, and regarding the 6 syllables, iambic trimeter. And the rhyming scheme is usually A, B, X, B. So that means that the third line doesn't have to rhyme with any of the other words at the end of the other lines. However, some ballads do. They employ AB, AB. So I would advise you just experiment with the rhyme scheme and see what works best for you. I would advise though that if you're writing a ballad of perhaps 4 or 5 stanzas, you do keep to that regular rhyme pattern. Unless of course, for effect, you want to throw a spanner in the works and create some tension in the poem. I'd also recommend that you read and listen to ballads so you get an idea for the sound, for the rhythm, and for that rhyming pattern. Also, it will give you opportunities to think about the subject matters, think about what types of stories ballads lend themselves to. I, for one, think they are fantastic for ghost stories, tales of the supernatural. I also think they're great for poems that are set in the long past, and also poems of unrequited love and broken hearts. Examples of ballads I strongly recommend you read are John Keats's La Belle Dame sans Merci, Thomas Hardy's During Wind and Rain, and Edgar Allan Poe's Annabel Lee. So 2 more poetry forms for you to consider, and I hope you find they inspire you to write. I hope you liked today's video. If so, please don't forget to subscribe. Also, hit the like button and ring the bell. Ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, bong, bong, bong. This video is one of a series on writing poetry and poetry forms. So if you haven't seen the others, please check them out. Until next time, from Carol and me, write well.